Well, today we continue our Lenten sermon series from the Psalms by looking at Psalm 95. And I don't know about you, but I felt that our study of the Psalms during this season of Lent has been very appropriate, not only in the weeks leading up to Easter, but also in the season of change and uncertainty that we are living in due to the coronavirus pandemic. The poetic imagery and deep heartfelt emotions of the Psalms provides expression to our worries, our fears, and our feelings that might otherwise be difficult to put into words. One of the things that I love about the Psalms is that the writers of the Psalms did not shy away from the painful and harsh realities of life. Although many of the Psalms depict God and the world in beautiful, soaring imagery, the Psalms also confront the deepest and harshest realities of life. And while this is a wonderful quality of the Psalms, I admit that it can be quite shocking when a psalm seems to start out light and airy and beautiful and then takes a startlingly harsh tone. Psalm 95 is one such psalm. And earlier, I had us read just the first half, and so I want to read that for us again. This time I'm going to read it from the Message paraphrase of the Bible. It goes like this: "Come, let's shout praises to God, raise the roof for the God who saved us. Let's march into his presence singing praises, lifting the rafters with our hymns. And why? Because God is the best, high king over all the gods. In one hand he holds the deep caverns and caves. In the other he grasps the high mountains. He made the ocean. He owns it. His hands sculpted the earth. So come, let us worship, bow down before him, on your knees before God who made us. Oh yes, he's our God, and we're the people he pastures, the flock that he feeds. Drop everything and listen as he speaks." Isn't that beautiful? Every single one of those verses, I think, could be taken and paired with a beautiful photograph of a landscape and put on a calendar, and I would buy it. Every single one of those verses. You have the majestic, the soaring mountains, the jaw-dropping stalactites and stalagmites of the caves and caverns. And just imagine a photograph of all those beautiful landscapes, perfectly illuminated and photographed by a photographer such as Ansel Adams or Galen. Just picture that. Imagine God creating the oceans, forming the earth with his hands, sculpting the earth. And then picture God's people all over the world bowing down before the Lord with God as our shepherd, looking out for us. But then we get to the next verse, which I want to read for us. Verse 8 of Psalm 95. And the soaring, beautiful imagery of the first half of the psalm seems to fade away. And here's what we have, once again, from the Message translation. The psalmist says, "Don't turn a deaf ear as in the bitter uprising, as on the day of the wilderness test, when your ancestors turned and put me to the test. For 40 years they watched me at work among them, and over they tried my patience. And I was provoked. Oh, I was provoked. Can't they keep their minds on God for 5 minutes? Do they simply refuse to walk down my road? Exasperated, I exploded. They'll never get where they're headed, never be able to sit down and rest." Now, I don't know about you, but if you're like me, you love the first half of the psalm, but with the beautiful mountains and oceans. But that second half, honestly, I'd prefer to skip over it, right? That whole part about how the people of God rebelled and how God was provoked and exasperated at them. And Psalm 95 ends with God saying they'll never get where they're headed, never be able to enter my rest. It sort of reminds me of one of those sketches from Saturday Night Live of Debbie Downer, the character who always shows up at social gatherings and interrupts the conversation with her negative pronouncements. Wah, wah. It's kind of the sound that's in the background, right? But even though God says in that psalm they'll never get where they're headed, we know that the Israelites did eventually enter the promised land, or at least the next generation did. And so what happened? What changed for God? Well, herein, I think, lies the beauty of the psalm. Because although the psalm does end with a harsh word from God, the end of Psalm 95 is not the end of the story for the Israelites. Rather, Psalm 95 is an invitation to place ourselves in the unfolding narrative of God's people. Psalm 95 is an invitation to look back, to see how God dealt with the people of Israel, and to consider, in light of that, what God might want to say to us today. I like to think of Psalm 95 as sort of a choose-your-own-adventure story. When I was growing up, I would love these choose-your-own-adventure books. This one is called Your Perfect Birthday, and it has 8 possible endings. I don't know if you've ever read stories like this. You don't read through them from front to back. Instead, what you do is you read each chapter, and then at the end of the chapter, you get to a page that says something like this. Here on this page it says, if you decide to stop and hide in the shack, turn to page 20. But if you decide to keep running straight into the sand dunes, turn to page 17. Which one are you going to choose? Are you going to hide in the shack, or are you going to go to the sand dunes? Well, the nice thing about this type of book is you can choose your own ending of the story. The thing is, when you're first reading the book for the first time, you don't really know which one is the best option. So you have to just go with your gut. You choose one option and you see where it takes you. But then maybe you read the book again and you can go through it and you can choose a different option. And you see how your choices would play out in that sense. In some senses, you become the author of your own unique story, of how you choose to follow the storyline. And Psalm 95 is in some ways sort of like that. It's an invitation to place ourselves into the story. It's an invitation to see what we're going to do. But we have the benefit of seeing where the choices took the Israelites. We see how it played out for them. We see how God interacted with them. They chose to rebel against God, and it usually didn't work out very well for them. But when they chose to follow God's commandments, when they chose to follow God's laws, it always led them in a good path. And so for us today, will we choose to rebel against God, or will we choose to follow God's path? The psalmist tells us in 95 verses 7 and 8, drop everything and listen. Listen as he speaks. Don't turn a deaf ear. Another translation says it this way, today if only you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And then it goes on to say, as you did at Meribah, and as you did that day at Massah in the wilderness. Meribah and Massah are references to the story of the Israelites in the book of Exodus. God had just led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt and had promised to take them to the promised land through the wilderness, to be with them, to guide them. We see that God wanted the people to enter the promised land. God wanted them to choose the adventure of faith, to follow God's commands, and it would have played out well for them. But in Exodus 17, the people arrived at what would be later called Massah and Meribah, which means to test and to quarrel. And it was there when they were walking through the wilderness where they run out of water, they began to quarrel with God. They asked Moses, why did God bring us out of slavery just to let us die of thirst in the wilderness? Why hadn't God just let them stay in slavery in Egypt where at least they had enough water to drink? Now, the problem was not just that they doubted God's ability to provide. The problem here was that they were doubting whether God would provide. And this was what was problematic. They weren't just doubting in God's ability to give them what they needed. They were fundamentally doubting God's goodness. In the end, God did provide water for them. He did it in a miraculous way. God instructed Moses to take his staff and to strike the rock, and water gushed forth out of the rock. And it actually wasn't at that point that God told them that they wouldn't enter the promised land. But it was that sort of doubting and that sort of quarreling with God that was indicative of their whole journey through the wilderness. They continued to doubt, contend with God, and it had real repercussions for them. Their lack of faith meant that they had to stay in the wilderness for 40 years, which meant that many of them did not enter the promised land. It was actually their children or grandchildren who got to go in. So often we'd like to think that our choices don't matter, that in the end God will just sort of give us all a passing grade. But the things that we do or don't do have real impact for us and for others as well. Now, there's no way that we're going to ever be perfect this side of heaven. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to doubt sometimes. But therein lies the choice. When we make mistakes, when we mess up, when we fail, we can either choose to curl up in a ball or to hide in the shack, or we can choose the adventure of faith, to trust in God, to go to the sand dunes or wherever God might lead us to go, and to come and to humbly repent before the Lord, to bow down, ask God for forgiveness when we mess up. As the psalmist says, "Come, let us worship, bow down before him, on your knees before God who made us." Oh yes, he's our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the flock that he feeds. Drop everything and listen. Listen as he speaks. The Apostle Paul provides more insight of what might happen when we choose to come before God in humility and repentance. Romans 5 that we read earlier, Paul says, "While we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly." God proves his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more surely then, now that we have been justified by his blood, will we be saved through him from the wrath of God. And here we see that, yes, we could try to do it on our own. We could try to be good or holy or righteous apart from God, but we're going to fail. We're going to fall. We can't do it on our own strength. Or we can choose to receive the love, the grace, the mercy, and forgiveness that Christ offers. Choose the adventure of faith, and choose to be reconciled with God, with that reconciliation that God made possible for us through Christ's death on the cross. Paul goes on to say, if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved from his life. Or as again the Message translation puts it, we now have an amazing friendship with God. And so while Psalm 95 provides this wonderful reminder of God's ability to protect and to provide for us, it also lays out the stark choices for us. Will we harden our hearts, rebel against God, refusing to trust in God's goodness? Will we spend our lives contending, quarreling with God? Or will we allow God to soften our hearts? Will we turn to God in obedience and trust, opening ourselves up to receive God's grace, mercy, and forgiveness that is offered to us through Jesus Christ? Friends, this morning, let's trust God. Let's choose to place our faith and trust in God. Let's choose to bow down and worship, to be reconciled with God through Jesus Christ. Let's look to Jesus as our great shepherd, the shepherd of the sheep. And let's place our faith, hope, and trust in God's goodness.